if you look at the modern enterprise today, what's the impact of AI on it? The answer is it's already in the enterprise, which is that what's the impact of automation technology on the enterprise, right? So if you go and I'm going to be arbitrary, go pick a large financial institution and you say, well, they have 100,000 employees. How many employees would you need to actually have if you didn't have those systems there today? And still be this running at the same scale and same level of profitability and all that sort of stuff, all things being equal. I would wager that it would be at least 10 to 15x just to actually kind of have that same business there. And so the impact of automation inside the enterprise is already there. We're just taking it kind of to that next level. And how do you go further? How do you go further with it?
Hi, my name is Dimitri Panici, and I'm a content creator, agency owner, and AI enthusiast. You're listening to the AI Agents Podcast, brought to you by Jotform, and featuring our very own CEO and founder, Ida Tank. This is the show where artificial intelligence meets innovation, productivity, and the tools shaping the future of work. Enjoy the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the AI Agents Podcast. In this episode, we have Mark Cowan, the head of product for Put It Forward. How you doing, Mark?
I'm doing great. Very great to be here. Thank you for your time.
Yes, for sure. So you're based out of Austin, which is obviously like a tech hub right now. It's very cool. I think that there is a lot of interesting companies coming out of it, and your guys is one of them. So I am curious, first and foremost, how did you kind of get into the position you're in? You've been with Put It Forward the entire time. I think for me, it's always an interesting question, like how does someone get into AI? Because while it might seem like something that has been at the forefront of all of our minds for the collective last 3 years, you've been at the company for over 10, and seeing a transition, I think, like that with a company getting into AI, someone who's been around in a company like that for that long, that's always cool to me. So let's hear this backstory.
The backstory. Just had been in a number of operating role and product development roles and leading organizations. Some you probably use their own technology, and running a really large technology team at a couple of large financial institutions. We had always been using AI in one form or another for the last really kind of 2 decades. If you think about financial systems, there's a lot of machine learning and artificial intelligence isn't necessarily new to them. It's just very narrowly applied. I think in terms of the broader application of AI, what you're speaking about, which is really in the last kind of 3 years, is around large language models and with a chat-based interface on top of it. That's something that's really kind of gotten into the the popular zeitgeist, as it were. But in terms of using AI and using it as a function inside of an application, it isn't new to Put It Forward. We've been innovating with it for probably as part of our product close to 8 years now. And we have it applied in a number of different scenarios. Now, it certainly has evolved to include, the public-based AI, which is sitting on top of large language models, et cetera. And we have aspects of that inside of our infrastructure and our product. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's a whole thing to talk about. So yeah, I think that's a fair point. Most people think of AI in the context of generative. Right. And now agentic, I guess, in the last maybe calendar year, probably more like 8-9 months. When you were starting out at Put It Forward, what do you feel like you guys predicted in regards to where AI would be at this point in time? And how far off was that prediction? I like this question too for people who've been a part of it for a while.
First, we were very grateful for whoever came up with the nomenclature around agentic, because it frankly simplified a lot of the conversation about the way Put It Forward was positioning and the problem set that we solve for in our customers. Because often we would say, well, like, oh, look, here, we connect the systems and we connect your business process and your workflows. And we have this AI stuff that figures things out and makes it better. And then it tells you what the next thing to do is. And there was always depending on who you're working with, there was a very quizzical look of like, what exactly is that? And how do I describe that to the other people inside of our organizations? And that was, something when we saw the definition of agentic come along, really helped us in that regard. In terms of where we thought it would be applied and where we are in the market space, not radically different in terms of the value that we bring into an organization. So I think it's important just to describe or kind of maybe level set in terms of the different types of AI that are out there. So when you think
Yeah,
about
let's do
large
that.
language models that are being used, so in answer to your question about the different kinds of AI, when you think about large language models and the agentic AI and kind of what's in the popular media right now, a lot of those are based on short-term memory inside of an organization, right? So you're taking something that's immediate, you're asking it a question, whichever kind of question it may be, to build something, to respond to something, to think about something, to form an opinion, research something, etc., and then give you an answer, right? And immediately, all of the context around that is lost. The input is gone. The reasoning model largely is finished doing what it's doing and it's discarded that. Versus the another way of looking at AI is where you are taking the long term and the institutional knowledge and all the information that goes into um, making a prediction or making an outcome or a decision or choosing the next best action and using that to define sort of what your model is and then basing it off of that, right? So there's two different types that are out there that interoperate with one another on some level, but they are unique and distinct from each other. And so we kind of vectored initially down the path of leveraging institutions' long-term memory. And what we mean by long-term memory is all the things that they do. If you look at an organization, and you can pick one, it doesn't matter, whatever industry they're in. They really are a set of algorithms defined as standard operating procedures, ways of working, and that applies to marketing, sales, operations, technology, HR, finance, manufacturing, building, shipping, et cetera, depending what industry you're in, right? So when you look at an algorithm, when you look at it from an algorithmic perspective, you say, okay, hey, there's a series of inputs and there's a series of outputs kind of at each step. What can I learn from those? How can I model those? And then how can I improve that decision with a better outcome or a better information going into it? Which actually informs, frankly, the name of our company, which is Put It Forward in that case, right? It's like, the best input, the best decision, put it out to the next person or the next, step in the process to make it better, right? Um, and that's kind of how we look at the two. Um, and each of them kind of have a trajectory that interplays off one another.
Okay, so what does the average like company that you work with look like?
In terms of the size, or
No, I think that's one part of it, but I know we talked about this, like kind of like some of the industries you work with, but what are their problems that they're facing, right? What are the size? I think is another good question. And yeah, I mean, maybe a use case or type of like aspect of your tool that you use, because a lot of people are just probably just thinking like, what tangibly in a company, right, does I keep wanting to say the wrong thing. Put it forward. Put it forward. Help us with.
so there's front to back, right? So
Mm-hmm.
kind of at the front end on, say, revenue side and revenue generation, there's things like identifying next best customer, next best action, churn risk, revenue at risk, those types of scenarios that are revenue attached. Mid office, you can think about things like project and portfolio management, where you have teams that are executing and they need to be synchronized with the kind of the next thing they need to do very quickly, and how do you optimize that into back office functions like finance and HR, um, where you are trying to manage and mitigate risk, and you're trying to optimize what you're doing with fewer people and more systems at the same time. And so we kind of step into those scenarios to help automate kind of really decisions that are being made there as effectively as possible. The types of organizations and the type of industries, um, I can probably pretty much guarantee you've used our software in some way, depending on what you're doing out in the marketplace. If it's booking or booking a table in a restaurant, or booking a flight, or purchasing an investment product or something to that effect, depending on who you're dealing with. You've probably used our technology in some way as part of that, and part of that customer experience, and even on some social media platforms as well. We kind of have supported them as well. It depends on the type of problem you're trying to solve for, but often our customers come to us with real tangible problems. They're like, okay, hey, we need to get better at keeping the customers we have. We need to maximize the amount of share of wallet that our customers have in terms of cross sell and upsell. We need to get better at keeping the attention of the customers that we have sort of on the front end. How do we leverage what we have? Now, if you think about how would you do that with an LLM, the answer is you wouldn't. Right? You couldn't do that at scale without actually having large scale data going into it that represents your institutional knowledge, right? So you need to have a kind of different approach than that, and you need machine learning and artificial intelligence and the same kind of infrastructure that you would use with an LLM, but you're applying it differently, right? And then integrating it into a workflow and a process flow, et cetera, right?
Nice. Okay.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting about this, right, is a lot of the verbiage you use on your website and talk about still has the term automation on there, where I feel like most people have kind of, and obviously there's AI on here too. Most people kind of utilize the phraseology now of AI as, the default. Oh, and agents, which you do have as well on here. Could you kind of describe to the audience what you feel like the differences are between AI and automation, and maybe even kind of how like agentic AI maybe intersects those two things? I feel like that would be something good to cover.
Sure. I mean, automation is something that allows you to do run a process, run an outcome with fewer hands touching it, right? Basically, or fewer.
That's a good answer. I like that.
Very simply.
Yeah.
If you look at the modern enterprise today, and thinking forward to maybe some follow-on questions here, if you look at the modern enterprise today of like, well, what's the impact of AI on it? Well, the answer is it's already in the enterprise, which is that what's the impact of automation technology on the enterprise, right? So if you go and I'm going to be arbitrary, go pick a large financial institution, and you say, well, they have 100,000 employees. How many employees would you need to actually have if you didn't have those systems there today, and still be this running at the same scale and same level of profitability and all that sort of stuff, all things being equal? I would wager that it would be at least 10 to 15x just to actually kind of have that same business there. And so the impact of automation inside the enterprise is already there. We're just taking it kind of to that next level. And how do you go further? How do you go further with it? So in terms of automation, yes, it's about being able to run something with fewer hands or fewer eyeballs as part of that process. Now, there's also automation in manufacturing. There's automation in discrete, chemical-based processes, or deep, kind of manufacturing or automated processes as well. There's a number of different places where you can apply it. There's also automation that you can apply to decision making, on the customer side, on frontline, types of scenarios and so on. So that's number one. Number two, in answer to your question, is, what is agentic? Agentic is really where you're given autonomy to something that is part of a process to make a decision for you. This is done every day out there as well. Now we're just applying it to other parts inside the process. An example of an autonomous decision that's made for you today is if you've ever had the opportunity to be in a self-driving car. That's a pretty fancy.
Yeah, I haven't yet.
Yeah, they're pretty cool. Yep. It's a little.
They're in Austin, if I'm not wrong, right? Like Tesla just released. Or not released. Well, they are beta testing or released.
There are some there. Yes, they have some.
Okay.
There, but the Waymo cars have been here for.
Oh yeah. Is that the Google, right? The group that was like from Google?
Yeah,
it's the Google cars.
It is still Google, as far as I understand.
Okay. Oh, okay.
I mean, from a scale perspective, they're doing. I don't know what they're doing, but I think they're doing like something like 50,000 trips a day or something to that effect. It's quite
Hmm.
significant. But that being said, that thing makes decisions for you every day. If you're inside of an airliner, flying around, there's an auto, the pilots take off and they take off and they land, but there's also a ton of automation systems there that are helping them out, especially on long haul flights. There's an autopilot and it makes decisions based on various inputs. So there's a number of different automation systems that are out there. And then, so where's it going? I think kind of where's the intersection
Mm-hmm.
point, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's a couple of popular ideas out there that are being experimented with at large. You have automation systems inside the enterprise, which are very discrete, robotic process automation systems, where they do things like, if I have three different systems, I've got to fill in a bunch of fields here. And then when I click enter, I take the output of that and then I cut and paste or, do some other stuff and put it into this next system in the chain. Those systems effectively make scripts, which are kind of fancy macros that input and
Yeah.
complete the next step in the action or the next step in the chain. The intersection of that with large language models, the hope there is that people will say, well, I can now start, creating the input into those and, driving it on its own. So that's one approach. There's also another approach, which we think about a lot at Put It Forward, is like from an
Okay.
algorithmic perspective, which is like, okay, those are series of actions that necessarily don't need to involve an end user. They don't have to have the person in front of the screen. You actually just need, an event or a piece of data, something to actually happen to trigger a series of outcomes. And how do you manage that across the systems, right? Which then may involve a human, right?
Sure.
At some point in the process, right? So there's different schools of ways to approach that.
Interesting. Yeah. So I think what I liked about what you just talked through there is that there's actually been some small not iterations, but implementations of automation for a while. I'd never considered the concept that the autopilot could be classified as automation, but this is the type of stuff where I think in the world that I'm in, it's a lot more of like specific knowledge work business type automation, right? Less on the physical side, which I would probably categorize that as like more physical, like tool, like, what's the word I'm looking for? Machine. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Geez. Right. Yeah. So machine automation is not something I had thought about. And that's kind of probably been in the world for a while versus
Certainly.
now what we're seeing with the knowledge work side of
with
automation.
the knowledge work, and so there's a question that kind of ask in that side of space, and where you think about sort of the future is okay. Well, what's the ratio of human labor to digital labor? That's the real question to kind of ponder inside of there, and how do you use digital labor in a very effective way? I know inside of Put It Forward, we have probably the equivalent of a dozen full-time digital laborers, doing different things. Now, do they run autonomously and can they run without a person interacting with them? No.
Okay.
Of our business, not necessarily kind of the way we apply things to a customer, right? And that can be as simple as, you're writing a requirements document for something, or you're writing a marketing piece of collateral. How do you use some of those tools to do research for the subject you're involved in versus, you doing it yourself, right? Those types of agents, you certainly make a difference. And also the popular ones that are out there around, coding and, the co-pilots, which are really, or agents really now in a lot of scenarios are just, rebranded co-pilots. But they are what they are, right? They kind of sit alongside you in the screen, and you can ask it a question and you can probe and go further into it and help kind of augment your own, learning, as it were, around that at a higher rate of speed.
Okay. So when do you feel like we'll be able to see, I guess, two things? One, for your own company, when do you feel like we'll maybe get to autonomous agents internally? If you think that'll even happen in a reasonable, foreseeable future? And when do you think that implementation you currently have right now will be consumer ready, on like a consistent basis? Because I can imagine there's a lot of context and a lot of processes and a lot of really strict guardrails you're putting on this agent to prevent error, right? In your own workspace. So like, when do you think, like I said, you'll be able to have those run decently autonomously internally? And then what you currently have now, those agents, when do you think that those could even be consumer facing on a more readily available basis?
So the answer to the question is in part in how granular you want to be. So I think that the top line answer is we already have autonomous agents running inside of Put It Forward and inside of our customers' environments.
Okay.
Right? They are part of our customers' workflows and process flows. The way you do that is actually by getting very granular on the level of work that you want it to do. Where we see a lot of conversation happening in the popular press and field out there is that there's a notion of having a generalized AI agent that can do
Everything.
work
Yeah.
that it's not, yeah, exactly, that it can just do everything, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now think about that from your own perspective, right? You probably had a first job somewhere. And, if you went in there and they asked you to do kind of everything that you're doing, like say for this podcast, you'd be like, well, wait a second here. I came from this area. I've got to learn this. I've got to figure out a whole bunch of stuff. Like that's not a reasonable expectation. And so you have to be able to, have something that's focused on a very specific set of tasks in order to make it work. Right. That's why it works well with coding, right? Because coding is highly structured. Right. And
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, I hadn't
by
considered that.
definition, right. And it's highly structured in describing a set of tasks and problems and things or whatever that it has to do. And that's why you can train it on. And most of the LLM models out there, the initial training set, frankly, was on code. Right. And that's why you get a lot of, very, a very highly structured set of data when you're responding to it. And the rest of us have been trained on, for the most part, on the open internet. Which opens up other questions. So the answer to what you're describing is that it's about how low level you atomize the problem that you're trying to apply an agent to, and if you can be very discreet against it. For example, say you are, you're a company that is dealing on the consumer level or on the business to business level with people that are buying and selling stuff or buying stuff from you. Right. And you're dealing with that at scale. And you need to be able to say, well, I need to personalize this in a way, or I need to be able to identify, is this someone that actually has the probability of converting or the probability of churning or going away, from us and going to a competitor. And how do you do that at scale? Right. I mean, that's a function inside of, you could argue as marketing or revenue teams or whatever, but, it's a function inside of the enterprise that, someone kind of has to do that. But when you start dealing at scale, it's just not possible. And then what I mean by it's not possible, that's not people aren't smart enough. There's just too much data to actually manage, at a
Yes.
cognitive level in a reasonable
Absolutely.
amount of time. And so you have to, yeah, exactly. So you have to slice that into a small function. That sort of stuff, you can do all day long with AI, like from Put It Forward. If you wanted to apply it to like, oh, hey, I want you to actually become my, new marketing director, Mr. or Mrs. AI digital labor, that's just unreasonable. But as an assistant to somebody who's working inside of there, that's a very reasonable expectation.
Yeah, it's a very good point you make, and a theme that we've been talking about on the podcast recently. And I'd like to ask each guest is, one, good point. There's a lot of misconception, I think, in the general people who are not directly in the know of, hey, I want to just have an agent that does a job, and you kind of not does a job in the sense of a task. They want it to do an entire high level, very detail oriented executing performer at a, C-suite level is kind of what their magical expectation is. But what you articulated is that, task-wise, yeah, they can do these things. They can pattern recognize about a specific thing. There's very interesting situation here, though, where that begs the question, and this is not to belittle associates. Hopefully I haven't done that in previous episodes, but associate level roles in like marketing agencies, for example, or in a lot of different companies are, for all intents and purposes, a list of if-then logic that they were told by their manager to do, right? But they're just doing the physical clicking on the screen, so to speak. I remember being an associate marketing manager in an ads agency. I don't think my job was actually practically hard. There was just a decent amount of volume because of the kind of way that shakes out. When do you feel like this string together of tasks will reach the point to where people at an associate level who have the least amount of experience, they don't have to make these like crazy strategic decisions, when those roles will maybe have high level competition with products that are selling agentic or agents?
It's funny. We deal a lot with marketing agencies as well for one reason or another, or marketing or kind of revenue teams, and so we see an impact of that, frankly, right now.
Okay, yeah, nice.
And but it's not that you are hiring your end-to-end marketing associate. What you're doing is you're taking slices of what they do out and automating functions of that when somebody who has maybe, I'm going to be arbitrary here, 2 years experience or 3 years experience on kind of a particular way of working inside of an agency can say, oh, I can do now what I had these people do by typing in some stuff and kind of getting the answer of it. Right now, applying that to the larger enterprise and extrapolating that out, very difficult. Why? Because inside the enterprise, you need to have repeatable motions and repeatable outcomes. If you've ever gone to an LLM and typed the same question in twice, you likely have not gotten the same answer. Contextually, it may have sounded the same, maybe pretty close, depending on the nature of your question, et cetera. But if you're asking it to, research something or to, kind of consider something, likely you haven't gotten exactly the same answer. That's problematic inside the enterprise, often because you need to be able to run a process forward and know exactly how it worked. But if you're ever under, like an audit function or a regulatory scenario, or you're in one of those types of industry that is highly structured, you need to be able to know exactly why something happened when it happened. So you need to know, well, why did the machine, or the LLM in this case, give the answer of ABC? You need to be able to trace that all the way back, and you can't do that with those types of systems. You can they can have citations, et cetera, with that, but you can't 6 months from now go back to like the query that you asked it and say, well, why did you say this then? It just,
that's a good point. I think,
right?
Yeah, it is kind of a mystery. I mean, what's very interesting, like there's so many different contentious topics that'll even come up. And what I find very frustrating is when people will have like this like arguing contest between like, oh, well, look what it's like. I have this list of facts. You have this list of facts, right? They'll like be arguing about a topic. Mainly this stuff happens on Twitter. So this is just advice to stay off Twitter. But they'll use whether GPT or Grok, and they'll be like, well, see, this is what it says about this. And I'm like, but you like framed it 2 words differently and it gave a different answer. Or even the same answer is different. Or the answer is different with the same question. So that's a good point. And I think that probably begs the question though, with tools like what you guys are building, how do you make sure that processes are, it's replicable, right? And solutions to problems that come up often are the same over and over again. Because I can imagine that being a difficult thing when making things to sell to companies and providing solutions to them when they see these different things that happen. And I understand we are talking about a generalized tool that, versus what you guys are, I'm sure is very specific and well trained, because, ChatGPT is just trying to reach the masses. I don't know if, it's obviously a different ballgame, but people probably still want to know, how do you kind of keep them in line, so to speak?
Well, like things like ChatGPT, first off, it's a super powerful tool. It's great, and so is Perplexity, and so are the other, kind of, applications that are out there. Um, but it's trained on the internet, right? And so therefore,
Classic.
everything that, that's it's lossy, right? And so when you look inside the enterprise, and we think about kind of like, the long-term knowledge that's inside the enterprise, you kind of actually have to train on that in order for it to be contextually relevant for the process that you're part of. And so, in answer to your question of how do we ensure that, one is that you're designing the AI as part of a process, not the process that you are working on, right? Or in. You have, error correction and all that kind of good stuff in it, but you're also not applying it into, you're applying it into scenarios where ambiguity is kind of expected and also accepted, right? So are we applying the AI that we use into, the manufacturing of, be arbitrary here, ball bearings that go into, uh, jet engines? No, that's or, rockets or something, right? Like those things require an incredible amount of precision in their manufacturing process, and that's where you don't want to have variability. But you can accept variability when you're dealing with, like, well, this is the, the spot price of this commodity, and we're buying it today, and what's the risk, relative to our, our capital allocation on it, or something like that. You can do things like that. You can say, well, Dimitri's a customer of ours today, and he's been hitting our website all over the place. What's the probability that he's going to become a customer, and what's the probability that he's going to buy a lot, medium, or little, or none? And then you can take kind of actions based on that, right? And then use the output of that as sort of the feedback into that model, right?
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And just to piggyback off what you said about it's trained on the internet, with the addition as well of web search capabilities, with a lot of these tools, I don't think people are quite aware of I think there's two different problems. Circular reasoning isn't the right phrase, but circular content. One, it's basically pulling from, I'll start with this. It's pulling from a list of publicly indexed pages that rank well. Those are primarily blogs for a number of SEO reasons I won't get into. But since those are the most easily and readily available things to get pulled from, what are people attempting to do in order to reach more people? They're making more blogs. And what are they using in order to make blogs? They're using AI. So if there is an incorrect piece of information, it's essentially like a circular feedback loop of incorrect foundation built on incorrect foundation. That's the one thing. The second thing as well is then people will use that as a source of truth without checking. And it's just very frustrating because they'll, like, if I web search now on Google, I'm sure you're familiar with the new AI overview, and they still have the thing on the bottom that says, it could be inaccurate. And it often is inaccurate in a lot of different, very specific questions. And it's always about framing and that type of stuff. So I kind of miss the structured snippets world that we used to live in, where I would at least be able to read that and know whether it actually answered the question correctly or not, or was even answering the question I was asking. Because sometimes it's simply not. It just doesn't get the context. So I think that's something that is different to point out, is like what you're dealing with is a strict set of information that is demonstrably true, right? Rather than what could just be a list of things that weren't essentially accurate at first, and then were pumped with more content that isn't actually that true all the time. So that's where some of the things come into place.
Yeah, and I think, just to follow on that, I think just to say it a slightly different way, what you're describing is, where does topical authority come from?
Mm,
And, when you look at the indexes, and whether that's, pick your favorite LLM that's out there and you're using, they are also backstopped by the traditional index engines, whether that's Bing or Google or what have you, right? Those things are also working in concert with the LLMs,
true.
and so that's how they kind of, when you go into one, it can actually, well, here's the citations and where you go, and if you want to navigate to it, right? Like, it's not building the same kind of um, schematic map of the internet the way, kind of traditional SEO is working. But when you get into, GEO or AEO, wherever you want to call it, it's looking for, it's establishing topical authority on a different thing. What we're doing as well is we're recognizing inside the enterprise is like, okay, hey, there's actually no greater authority of your customers than your CRM system and your marketing system and your support system, because that's what they do. Right, at the end of the day, why would I go out on the internet to find out if, what Dimitri's products that he likes from us, right? When I just have to kind of go into this system, and by the way, I can see, you know 10,000 other ones that are very similar to you, right? And kind of see what's going on all at the same time. That's sort of, I'd say, the
That's
fundamental difference. But the common thing is topical authority in between the two of them, right?
that's a pretty good point. Yeah. Topical authority. Yeah. Where does it come from? Fair enough. Okay. Well, you talked a little bit about how right now we're seeing an impact on the marketing agencies, so to speak, with the different tasks getting automated and whatnot. Where do you think the constraint is right now on that not being the entire job from an associate level being taken out, and how long do you think that constraint's going to take to kind of be removed?
That's an interesting question.
Right, because like it could always be compute, it could be training time of the model, compute time in general. Because like, if I'm not wrong, I'm forgetting the time frame. Maybe it's every 6 months. Consecutive agent runtime doubles. Right now, there's some interesting stats out there.
Well, the amount of just the sheer amount of compute that's being deployed in North America and Europe and the rest of the world is staggering.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so never mind everything that comes along with that. That once you have compute
Water,
deployed, you
have there's that whole chestnut. Yeah, what I'm talking about. Yeah.
But there's also, software that has to be deployed on top of that and to make it work, right? And if you kind of like look historically at, the deployment of technology, kind of first does come the hardware layer, certainly, right? But then there's a multiple in the amount of software that comes on top of that. And then services, et cetera, that kind of come along. But back to your question about, what's the prediction around timeline before you could have have something autonomous do a complete job? I guess it depends on how the definition of what that job is. If you were going back to your own previous experience of, being an associate level first career job, at a marketing agency, depending on the size of the agency, what you're doing, I'd argue probably a lot of that could be automated now. Now, could you automate that without having any supervision and not having any checks over that? No, you wouldn't do that. So I think there's that orchestration, supervision, management function that's not going to go away. I also think that if you were to play this forward and look at, well, what's the typical knowledge worker going to look like 5 years from now or 10 years from now, et cetera, you would say, well, they're actually going to be an individual that has half a dozen, agents working with them or for them or under them that they are, engaging with, right? That, I think, is kind of like what it'll look like. The timeline around that, hard to say, because you're also asking to predict on external factors like the economy and the environment and, the political landscape and so on that influence what happens inside of an organization, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. There's so many different. I feel like there's so many different things that are happening. It's moving so quickly. There's so many questions people are asking. What is like the main I guess, aspect of agentic AI that you're most intrigued with in the next calendar year, and B, you feel like your company is most poised to take advantage of and bring to market?
One of the most interesting things that we see around agentic AI is, how do we help people make better decisions? I think that certainly aspects of that are contained in the LLM models that are out there, or at least sort of that interface into them and training them. And this kind of goes back to your question where you have kind of dueling answers. Well, okay, are you just having people read dueling readouts, or do they actually have a high level cognitive level of capability where they're like critically reasoning what they're seeing, right? If you surrender critical reasoning to what you're reading on a screen, we're all in trouble, right? At some level, right? And so, like, I think
True.
that, you still have to think about what it is that you are seeing. If this allows you to get to the answer, or at least closer to it much faster. So bringing it back to kind of what we see inside Put It Forward is it's the stringing together of different very discrete agents inside of a process that can work together, that involve humans at critical points, and that humans can also drive themselves. That's where we see kind of the things that are very interesting out there. And where does that translate to for the modern enterprise? Well, it translates into do more with less, more efficiency, better, higher quality decisions, and an improved way of working. And then ultimately, that translates into hopefully a better, customer experience or better quality of life. Let's just say that for all of us. That's where I think it ultimately goes to.
A better quality of life. That's I guess that would be the goal for everybody, wouldn't it be? For what we're doing with
It certainly
AI.
would be. Well, why do we, someone invented the refrigerator at some point and said, another one said, oh yeah, that actually makes my life better. 'Cause that's a good thing to have, and so on and so forth, right? Not to trivialize it, right? But it's just that, this technology does have to have meaning and purpose. If it doesn't, then don't use it. And I think the world's full of examples where technology has been created without a clear problem that it can be applied to. That's a benefit to everyone else, right?
Yeah, good points. Is there anything that you would like to finally kind of plug or make a statement on before we end this out? I think we're getting to the end of the episode.
I think that when people are considering where to apply AI inside their enterprise, it requires careful thought, and how to, and what you're actually going to get out of it. I think that also, if you don't have the skill sets around, data and data intelligence and decision intelligence, you need to acquire them. Surrendering this to, vendors or to LLMs that are out there, is potentially very dangerous, unless you kind of have a very strong, acumen around kind of the technology and the problem space that you're solving for. Inside Put It Forward, we try and make that as transparent as possible. Everything inside the organization and the products and the platform is visible to the people that use it. It's not a mystery. You know exactly why you're getting the outcome. You can go forwards and backwards and have traceability around, why a decision or a recommendation was made. And I think those things are extraordinarily important inside the enterprise, going forward, especially as we start relying more and more on these systems. That's kind of what I think about the where to frame the conversation, as it were, if you were looking at it.
No, absolutely. I think that's a fair warning. Delegating your entire mind to what's on a screen, probably not the most advisable thing to do. But I guess since, for the purposes of this episode, we're closing it out, and I'll plug what you're doing for yourself, since you actually chose to give advice instead of plugging, which I give you kudos for. Shout out to Mark. Thank you so much for coming, and please everyone check out putitforward.com. That's put it forward, payitforward.com, not payitforward.com, which I accidentally said in the first iteration of this recording. But anyways, thank you so much, all of you, for listening. If you like this episode, please leave it a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the works. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next one.